The New Testament lesson comes from the book of Acts, chapter 17. I'm going to begin with verse 16 because it gives a better background to the passage that's listed in the bulletin. We know that Paul is now in Athens, and we pick him up at that point. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "Well, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. So Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" Now the Greek for this is agnosto theo meaning theology and God, agnosto spilling into English as the word agnostic. So to an unknown God. "What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him." I love this part of the text. They would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. And since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. Well, God has overlooked the times of human ignorance. Now God commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him up from the dead. Well, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead there in Athens, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Sometimes you just have to preach to a tough crowd like the one Paul had today, like the young preacher who was giving his first sermon and said to the congregation, "I take as my text for this morning that Jesus fed 5 men with 5,000 loaves and 2,000 fishes." And a parishioner yelled out, an older parishioner, well, that's nothing, I could do that. And the very next Sunday, he wanted to make sure he got it exactly right and said, as I take from my text today, that Jesus fed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he looked at the old parishioner and he said, now, could you do that? And the parishioner said, of course I could. And he said, how? With the leftovers from last week. Sometimes it's a tough crowd, you know. Back in Texas, there was a time where a large man carrying a dummy would come into churches and interrupt the sermon. And it happened in a Baptist church. A friend of mine was the pastor. He called me. He said, Billy, get ready. He may come and disturb your service. And he told me that earlier this man had come down the aisle right in the middle of his sermon and stopped right in front and yelled out, I have something I want to say. And the pastor said, you just need to sit down and we'll talk to you after. Someone will listen to you. No, I want to say something right now. The pastor looked at him sternly and he said, you are not going to speak at this church right now. And the man looked disheartened and said, okay, well then I'll go where I can give my message. Turned around, made his way up the aisle. And the pastor said, would a couple of deacons escort him out? And 200 deacons helped him out the door. Sometimes we just have a tough crowd to preach to, and certainly Paul did in this passage in Acts 17 this morning. His passage is a little bit like Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in London, where you used to pay your few shillings and you could stand on a soapbox and you could talk about this philosophy or that political persuasion. And if you went to Speaker's Corner, you would see lots of speakers up there, and there were little crowds gathered around. The better the speaker, the bigger the crowd. They would catcall and criticize. Now, the closest we might get to that is something that happened to one of our pastors during a 5 o'clock service a few weeks ago. She was preaching along, and she got a text on her iWatch. It began buzzing, and she looked down, and one of the parishioners was saying, you could use this scripture in your sermon right now. That was the last time she ever wore a iWatch in the service, at least in the sermon. Paul had this experience as Paul marched into Athens, the intellectual center of the world, where people used to come from miles around just to hear different speakers talk about different subjects. Paul was just the newest professional speaker, peddling his wares, just showing them off. And people came from miles around to hear what this babbler has to say. Why is he there? Why does Paul even care about sharing with these folks who are atheists and agnostics? Well, I think it's because Paul is part of a Christianity that is not a blind faith. His Christianity is not only a way of life, it's also an explanation of life. Paul stands in the great tradition of Christian thinkers with steel-trap minds who didn't want to think about the world in a closed-off way, did not have closed minds as some in the Middle Ages did, who were closed off to modern astronomy and tried Galileo for heresy. No, Paul stands in the great tradition of Christian thinkers who know how to talk the faith with the world. Christian thinkers like Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Pascal, William Temple, C.S. Lewis, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, Martin Luther King Jr., Nadia Bolz-Weber, Barbara Brown Taylor. They know how to deal with the world and the world's questions. My old professor of homiletics, George Buttrick, had been preacher at Harvard for 10 years, and he said, Bill, that was the toughest crowd I ever preached to. The brightest minds in the country all gathered, exegeting, parsing every sentence, criticizing, analyzing everything I said. That's the kind of crowd Paul was preaching to that day at the Areopagus on Mars Hill in Athens. Epicureans, Stoics, people of all persuasions. And he was trying to figure out, as all of us do when we stand in a pulpit like this and begin to preach, how can I get through to them? I think about that every week. How can I get through to you what the gospel is really saying? How can I get their attention? Paul was thinking as he stood before them that day. Notice that he uses one of the most skillful rhetorical strategies in the history of rhetoric. Instead of saying, well, you all are just a bunch of fools, you're a bunch of idiots who worship all these gods and they're all fake, or instead of coming down from the mountain as Moses did with 2 tablets, pitching them at everyone, saying, you just a bunch of idolaters and fools. No, Paul does something very skillful. He says, I perceive, you Athenians, I perceive in every way that you are very religious, because I see all these gods around your city. What a brilliant start. He got their attention right off the bat. When I used to teach public speaking at the University of Pittsburgh back in the early 70s, I remember in the fall of 1973 making this point to a class: you need to get people's attention at the beginning of a speech. And the next student who got up said, I'm giving a speech on gun control, pulled out a pistol and shot it off. Once we resuscitated the class, I said, that was a little more than I was expecting. Fortunately, it was a blank, so it didn't put a hole in the ceiling. That's the kind of start Paul wants, but much more subtle. Athenians, I perceive in every way that you are very religious. You, in fact, are more religious than you think. What a great opening. John F. Kennedy gave one of the most brilliant speeches ever given to take a crowd that's opposing you and turn it around. He had just been reading that Norman Vincent Peale had put out a pamphlet when he was running for president, put out a pamphlet saying, do we want a Catholic in the White House? Do we want the Pope to be dictating public policy in the United States? And Kennedy knew he had to do something. He had to hit it head on, and he did it brilliantly. He picked out the Houston Ministerial Association, and he went right down there to speak. And he got up in the podium, and he said, you know, down the road here in San Antonio is the Alamo. Do you remember? Yeah, say it with me. Remember the Alamo. And they all said it with him. And he began to talk about people who fought in the Alamo. William Travis, James Bowie, Davy Crockett. Oh, yeah, we remember. And he got them all riled up on the Alamo. And then he asked them a question. He said, was there a religious test for those who fought in the Alamo? No, no religious test. He repeated the question, was there a religious test for those who fought in the Alamo? No, no religious test. Well, there shouldn't be one for running for president either. And he got him right there. And that one speech was part of what turned the tide in that election, because it was published all over the country. When you have a situation which is difficult, you have to figure out something to say, and that's what Paul did. He made a connection with them. Years ago, I was preaching and lecturing around South Korea, and I came into a university, a Christian university, to do 2 chapel services. Did the first chapel service, went great. Had my translator, a professor who was from Korea, fluent in English and Korean. We're going like this. And then the second service is about to begin, and the host comes up to me and says, oh, by the way, Dr. Carl, did we tell you that all these students are atheists and agnostics? They are required to be here, so could you please give a sermon and not talk about God very much? Well, no, I don't think I can do that. But thank you for letting me know they're all atheists and agnostics. And I turned to my professor and said, just go with me. We'll do this together, and we're just going to make it up as we go. And I looked at the crowd and I said, these students who were just, staring at the ceiling or counting their shoelaces, they didn't want to be there. And I said, it's great to be here with you, and I want you to know that when I was in college, I went through an atheistic, agnostic period. And right before I decided to become a minister, I went through this period because all the business majors kept saying to me, why are you wasting your time with religion? Money is all that counts in the world, and I had no answer. I was just living on the inherited faith from my parents, and you can't make it on only an inherited faith. So I went through this period of agnosticism. I couldn't pray. I just couldn't do it. And then one day, I felt the presence of God in a way I'd never felt it before. William James, in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, says, you cannot explain a religious experience to someone else. So I can't really explain. I just know one moment I didn't feel God, the presence of God. The next moment, I felt God flooding into my life. And so I told the students that. And I said, you're here for a reason. God has a purpose in your life. You're trying to figure out what you're going to major in. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And God has a purpose for you. You may think there is no God, but that's like saying there's no sun on the other side of those clouds. And I just went on, and my poor translator was just trying to keep up with me because we were just going like this. And at the end, many students came up to talk. All I tried to do was make a point of contact with them. As Paul says, Athenians, I perceive as I walk around your city that you are a very religious people. You are more religious than you think. And even in this country, many who are experiencing the decline of mainline religion still are more religious than they think. Jacques Ellul, the French philosopher, says that being an atheist is very hard because it means living in total independence. And that's really hard to do. So Paul makes this connection and helps us understand that we are called to come to God. Hedrick Smith, the New York Times writer, talks about this in his book, The Russians. He says that one night, as the Paschal Vigil was reaching its height about midnight in the 12th century Cathedral of the Assumption in Vladimir, a giant party broke out and was ending across the square, and hundreds of young people were spilling out onto the square just as the Paschal Vigil was reaching its height. And the communists ringed their way around the church, presumably to keep the young hooligans from destroying the church. But there was another reason, Smith says. They could all see in the eyes of these young people fascination with what was going on inside the church. He said, we all have a repressed desire for ritual. There is this God-sized hole in all of us that only God can fill. Here is Augustine, the secular rhetorician and womanizer, making his way to church week after week in Ambrose's church until one day it took, and he became one of the greatest theologians in Christendom. Here is Nathanael wondering about Jesus, and Philip says, come and see. Here is Cornelius, whose wealth and position in life would make you wonder, why does he need religion? But he still invites Peter on a preaching mission. He was a physician that we knew in Richmond, world-renowned OBGYN professor at Medical College of Virginia, read the medical boards every year in Chicago, known internationally for his discoveries in gynecology, and he came to church every Sunday, but he never joined. Why was he there? Why are we even here? Karl Barth says it's because we want to know about God. We want to experience the eternal verities of our faith, and yet sometimes we wonder why we are here. Is it just to hear beautiful anthems, to hear a sermon every once in a while, some scripture, a prayer, sing a hymn? Why are we even here? Some of us are more like Schleiermacher's culture despisers, wondering why we are even here. And that's the kind of person Paul takes on in this sermon. He catches us all up short. Athenians, I perceive in every way that you are more religious than you think, for you have this inscription on an altar to an unknown God, agnosto theo. And I'm here to tell you that that God is one called Jesus Christ, who will literally transform your life if you will give your life to him. And I'm sure it wasn't easy for some of them. I want to be honest with you. I sometimes find myself identifying with the Athenians in this story, more than with Paul standing up preaching. Maybe you do too. Academic as I am, I find myself often asking questions about God. Sometimes I feel like I don't even pray very well. I see myself in this crowd there on Mars Hill. I see myself among the college students in Korea. And then one day, something happens. And God's grace floods over me in a way I haven't experienced it before. Maybe it's a new friend who helps me know something about myself that I never knew before. Maybe it's a line in a hymn, a phrase in a prayer. Maybe it's something that happens, something powerful happens between two people. And I can see now suddenly God is active in our world and in our lives. And all of a sudden I believe it even more than I did before. Maybe that happened that day with Paul. But not with every one of them, because some of them scoffed. Some of them said, he's just a babbler. We don't want to hear any more of this. But some of them, for some of them, it caught and it grabbed them. You know what I think is the best description of preaching I've ever heard? Tom Long, who preached here a few weeks ago, said that preaching is like pitching a bucket of water over a room full of long-necked bottles. Not much is caught. You think about that one just for a minute. Not much is caught. But some of them caught it that day when Paul was preaching in Athens. And I don't think it was the brilliance of his oratory or his rhetorical flourish. I don't think it was his thought. I don't think it was anything he said up here. I think it was the power of the gospel to transform lives. So hear me today, Athenians of IPC. Who among you can be changed by the power of this word, even now, here? I can tell you this, if it can grab a crusty theologian like me, just imagine what it can do for you. Why? Because the God who speaks to you through this gospel is the creator of the universe, but he is also the God who loves you more than you have ever been loved before. To this God be all honor and blessing and glory and praise from this day forth and forevermore. God bless you all.